convidamos, então, o vice-presidente do Jain Family Institute, Dr. Paul Katz, if you will. Juntos, então, vão fazer o lançamento da publicação do IFSWF and Fletcher School Report, intitulado Os Fundos Soberanos Regionais podem se expandir e crescer na América Latina? Passo, então, a palavra ao Dr. Paul Katz.
Realmente uma honra poder apresentar o lançamento de um novo relatório do International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds sobre os fundos soberanos na América Latina. E tivemos no JFI a oportunidade de apoiar a tradução desse relatório para o português. Acho muito importante poder compartilhar as aprendizagens do International Forum dos últimos anos, nesse momento em particular aqui no Brasil. Com a consolidação de várias iniciativas subnacionais de fundos soberanos, acho que é um momento muito oportuno para abrir essa conversa e abrir o diálogo em particular com fundos internacionais. O que vamos ver é que, neste momento em particular, tem muitos investidores e fundos soberanos internacionais olhando para o Brasil. E o que estão procurando são parceiros aqui no Brasil, que podem apoiar investimentos, que podem mostrar que tem, e realmente não sei como traduzir essa frase para português, que tem skin in the game aqui no Brasil, por parte das entes governamentais. E acho que esse relatório, em particular, traz essa visão e permite uma reflexão sobre o papel-chave e o papel de aceleração, basicamente, de multiplicidade, de adicionalidade que os fundos soberanos brasileiros podem trazer para o cenário local. Então, é realmente com muito prazer que passo a palavra a Victoria Barbary, que vai apresentar esse relatório para vocês.
Thank you very much. The good news is that we've already talked quite a lot about bits of this report, so I can be quicker and I can let you get on with your Friday night in Rio, which is, I'm really jealous because I've got to get on a plane this evening. I'm also very delighted to have persuaded my designer to use this fabulous picture for the cover, because I was very, very, very consistent that this had to be the cover picture for the report. This report really came out of some conversations that I've been having for years now, which is the question is, IFSWF now represents 51 sovereign wealth funds from 47 countries, and we only have 3 members in Latin America. And the question is always, why? And this is also an important question for me because I put together all the programming, as Leandro says, and all of our programming is for the Eastern Hemisphere because that's where everybody is. So our Western Hemisphere members get left out, and I don't like that. So the question really was, why has Latin America lagged other regions in establishing sovereign wealth funds? So in this project, we partnered with the Fletcher School at Tufts. I've worked with them for many years. And FLA, the Fondo Latinoamericanos de Reservas, who is the kind of IMF for some of the region, to really try and understand why we don't have as many sovereign wealth funds in this very rich and diverse region, and how we might be able to prompt a conversation about creating a second generation of sovereign wealth funds in Latin America. Beep. There we go. It does work. La La Land was right. Right, so this is a very good, this is just an example, a representation of what the landscape looks like now. And as you can see, the region is dominated by traditional stabilization funds, really. And most of these are invested in low-risk, low-return fixed income assets. So I think I'm just going to highlight a few funds. So Mexico has the budget stabilization, Petroleum Budget Stabilization Fund, or FEEP, and it also has a savings fund. But the first fund, which is our member, is the fund that does the hacienda hedge. So we all, you live around here, you know what the hacienda hedge is. I'll also just draw your attention to the Fundo Ahorro de Panama, which is another one of our members. And that is actually, to Anna's question earlier, that is actually funded from the proceeds from the taxation going through the Panama Canal. So you can fund a sovereign wealth fund for anything. It's about $1.5 billion, and that is an intergenerational savings fund. And then finally, the newest kid on the block around here is in Guyana, the Natural Resource Fund, which is a savings fund. As you will probably know, Guyana has one of the largest oil finds. It will probably be the largest monster out there, the last monster out there. So they've now currently got about $2.5 billion. It is an intergenerational savings fund, but they've currently, back to capacity, it's run out of the central bank, and they have their $2.5 billion in the Fed earning 5.2%, I think. So there's not a lot of real investment or portfolio investment going on. So I just wanted to kind of show you some of those, and I think we all know Chile's funds as well. Am I going to have to keep putting it through my head? I am. Right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the roadblocks and risks for why is these questions. So traditionally, so if we think about the kind of Middle Eastern funds, these kind of sovereign wealth funds have been established in small countries with tiny populations generating very large fiscal surpluses, and have had really limited spending needs and economic absorption capacity. But despite that great resource wealth in Latin America, most countries, as you can see from this chart, have not historically run fiscal surpluses in the period since 2010. And in fact, average deficits in the region have run, as this chart shows, at approximately 3% of GDP. I think what a point is that even when states have enjoyed sizable resource revenues, most governments on all sides of the political divide have been relatively reluctant to strike fiscal balances, instead opting to run fiscal deficits to finance social projects. And that has really resulted in quite a lot of instability economically in the region. Where we have seen sovereign wealth funds established, quite often that desire to fund social projects has really made governments change legislation. And we were talking about this, I think some of the mayors were talking about this first thing this morning, about how you stop the legislation being changed to fund immediate priorities. And I think the most obvious example of this is, I don't want to bring up this country, but I'm going to, is in Venezuela. They established the first sovereign wealth fund on the continent in 1994, and it didn't last more than a decade, as the legislation got changed and changed and changed until basically it had all been spent. So I don't think that that's going to be an issue in Brazil, by the way, because the institutions are so much stronger, but it has happened, and it's one of those things that that institutional strength and robust governance is so important when we think about sovereign wealth funds. But if we go to really, this instability has meant that, come on, I've got a dead battery. Hey, I am going to have to do that. So consequently, because of this fiscal instability, central banks have prioritized safeguarding their current assets. So for this report, FLA very kindly interviewed the central banks and the finance ministries from all of their members. And they did it very kindly for me in Spanish, so they could really get into the weeds. And essentially what we found out was that because they've got limited reserves, there's economic stability, the politics, the political sensitivities, most central banks have their board linked to the political cycle. There's real institutional capacity constraints. And all of these things were continually echoed in the interviews that were done, both in regional central banks and in finance ministries. And so what's happened is that they've really doubled down on doing the basics really well, keep the IMF happy, keep everything in keep everything ticking over, but rather than kind of bolstering the balance sheet and thinking about putting anything away for the longer term. But that means that really they're not providing a career pathway for young talent. And quite often they're not even hiring people. I was at the FLAR annual conference last November, and we were speaking to one central bank governor who said he hasn't hired a new person in 10 years. So really, they're not recruiting, and when they do recruit, people don't stick around because there's not a stimulating job for them to do because it's all very, very basic. So this is the kind of situation we're really seeing across the region. So that's where we were when we were thinking about sovereign wealth funds. Oop, I've gone too far. So I wanted to say a little bit about development finance in Latin America as well, because, and I think this is a region-wide challenge, is that this risk aversion of keeping reserves in fixed income assets isn't just evident in central banks. As you know, more than most people, the region has a really successful ecosystem of development financed institutions, and these have established track records, and they've played a really central role in addressing the long-term financing requirement for infrastructure projects. As we were looking at a report from the Inter-American Development Bank, and it was saying that they've provided financing for over 20% of the capital raised for infrastructure between 2004 and 2021. However, to close the infrastructure gap, we've got to double that, right? And that's a challenge if you are only looking at debt financing. That's a lot of debt. So essentially we've had, as I said, they generally, and you know this, they generally provide credit or guarantee capitals. And quite often, this is partly because it's disincentivized because of interest rates. But really, in developing countries, loans, credit, and debt financing are really only one part of the puzzle of the capital structure, and particularly, but not exclusively, for major infrastructure projects. If we're looking at the private sector, private investors from both home and abroad are looking for entities to share the risk of any investment by investing in equity or equity-like instruments to ensure the alignment of interests between investor and sponsor. When we were writing this, I spoke to one of my members, Cofides, which is the sovereign wealth fund of Spain, which invests quite heavily in this region. And their point was, we find it really difficult to find partners willing to take on equity risk and align their interests with us. So this isn't just us making things up. This is actually a problem that's been identified by a major foreign direct investor. And I'm not denying that there have been some moves to increase risk exposure. So BNDES, who we've been speaking to this week, CAF, Bank Holdex, they all have limited private equity fund investment programs, but it's just not big enough to attract the degree of private capital that is needed. However, we are in the last year, and this is really new, so this is all from 2024, we are beginning to see a little bit of a shift towards attitude for risk and partner with private investors. So at the beginning of 2024, I think this was in March, IDB Invest, which is the Inter-American Investment Corporation, which is part of IDB, changed their operating strategy to really focus on attracting inward capital. So as you can see there, to be originate to share conduit for channeling capital. I hate reading slides. To have a bolder risk appetite, to focus with financial and non-financial re-risking, and to crowd in private investors. And this is totally new, that we haven't really seen this in this region before at this scale. So really, there is a nascent opportunity for the governments of Latin America, and I'm not talking just national federal government, I'm talking about subnational as well, to catalyse this evolution and established a new generation of sovereign wealth funds to invest alongside development finance institutions. So, how do we think about this new development finance model for Latin America? Across the world and amongst sovereign wealth funds, we've seen a substantial innovation about how the sovereign wealth fund model can be adapted to drive economic development and diversification at home. But we haven't really seen it in this region. And this is where, mercifully, we've covered a lot of this in the previous conversation. So, strategic investment funds, what are they? So, I have some very good friends at the World Bank who wrote the Bible on strategic investment funds. It took them, I think, 6 years. I thoroughly recommend this publication for you to have a look at. It's massive, but it's really good. And it will tell you everything you need to know. And I can't ever think of anything that they haven't done. So, but you can see what strategic investment funds, how they define them. What I just want to, while you're reading that, I just want to talk a little bit about that's how they're structured, what do they do? So there is one model, which is where a government creates a strategic investment funds by giving it straight state-owned enterprises to manage. And their job is to act like a private equity fund, steward those companies and create national and regional champions, and then privatize them so that they can then reinvest that money in the local economy or abroad, actually. So that's a traditional model that was pioneered by Singapore's Temasek. They can also, as we were discussing earlier, promote economic development and diversification by investing in strategic sectors as identified in a national development plan, for example. We talked about how they can attract long-term foreign direct investment by acting as a promoter or a partner of choice and mitigating perceived risks, which I've already mentioned. And another thing that they can do, and this is an interesting one, and it's not done by that many of these funds, is enhance local stock market liquidity by anchoring IPOs, investing in local funds, and backing new stock issuances of major local companies. And there are quite a few funds that have done that. I mean, I'd like to say this is all shiny and new and I'm bringing you something from the 21st century, but I'm not. This has been the first one of these funds that was founded was in 1953 in Kuwait, and it had from the outset a mandate to invest at home for economic development purposes. So we're going all the way back to 1953. But as this chart shows, actually those numbers are deeply unclear. But that big spike, the first spike is in 2006, and the really tall one is in 2010. But we can see that, so the hybrid funds are funds that might do savings, intergenerational savings, as well as development, but they all have some form of development mandate. But as you can see, the majority of the ones that have been done, I mean, that's 2024 at the end. We've had, 3 sovereign wealth funds already established this year, and they have all had a strategic investment mandate. So, as we know, this isn't a new thing. And I just want to run really quickly, and we were talking about this earlier, I was talking about Nigeria, but I want to highlight 3 other examples of some lessons that we can learn. So Fonds started off literally as a development fund, and it's grown into one of the biggest investors in Senegal. It makes a really good profit, by the way. This is not a development, kind of not-for-profit entity. It's not giving grants, it's investing equity into lots of green energy. All the solar farms pretty much in Senegal are anchored, not majority owned, but anchored by Fonds. They invest in women-owned enterprises. They make really good money out of investing in women-owned companies. And that is incredibly important in Africa. But they also they've got a big gas find, and because they've developed all of this financial expertise, they, instead of the central bank or the finance ministry, Fonds has been tasked with managing their intergenerational savings fund. So now they are developing a whole new set of skills to manage a traditional sovereign wealth fund alongside the development fund. So these are actually really important to develop financial skills within the country, which, as we were talking about, is part of that holistic way of thinking about developing your economy post-hydrocarbons. FGIS from Gabon is a really interesting one because they have a massive rainforest too. And they are not only looking at trying to develop their country, but they're also trying to work out how to do it without cutting that rainforest down. Because if they cut that rainforest down, the whole kind of southeastern corner of Africa has no water. So they've been looking at how they can use their rainforest in a productive way, but maintaining the biodiversity and the environmental and climate importance of it. And I think another thing that's important about FGIS is that it is the, going back to the same thing about FONSIS, is that FGIS has been tasked with managing the Gabon's carbon credit program and its carbon market. So again, it's these institutions are really ways of incubating innovative financial knowledge. And finally, the Indonesia Investment Authority, and this is possibly my favorite example, not only because I helped do some of the consulting to fund it, but also because they're great. But these guys were founded 5 years ago, and they were given, actually for Indonesia, big, massive democracy, lots of young people, big rainforests. They were given a paltry $5 billion by the government to go and develop infrastructure. They've, as I say here, in 5 years, they've attracted another $5.2 billion from the private sector and sovereign wealth funds and pension funds to develop that infrastructure. And it all has its climate impacts assessed. It all has so whether it's roads, energy, whatever they're doing, they make sure that it is developed with all those ESG considerations factored in. So it can work, and it's a really, really good example. But one thing that isn't on this slide, and it isn't because I did this presentation before I'd been here a week, and it occurred to me that in countries like Brazil, with a developed ecosystem of financial institutions, whether that's public or private, governments have worked with these institutions to establish substantial sovereign-backed investors. So they're not entirely sovereign-owned. So if I look at the National Infrastructure Investment Fund in India, that is structured as a private equity fund that is 49% owned by the state and 51% owned by the major banks in India. Similarly, Cofides from Spain, who I was talking about earlier, they have the flip, which is the government owns 51% of the management company, and the big banks like Santander, BBVA own the other part of the management company. The difference between these two models is the money that Cofides manages is entirely from the government, while NIIF, they manage 3 private equity funds and 1 fund of funds that are pooled from the private sector. And those were all anchored by Asian and Gulf sovereign wealth funds. So there are lots of different models that you can use to really generate, using some state money, to generate private sector investment. So let's apply some of this quite briefly. And I am almost finished, and you can go to the cocktail. And I was saying this earlier, there is a huge opportunity here. But I know from having spent a year writing this report and from coming to Brazil twice in that time, is that reducing the debt burden for many Latin American countries remains a priority, and there's very little fiscal headroom, and I'm totally aware of that. However, I would argue, and I think somebody said this morning, that concentrating on debt, the debt status, concentrating on debt and the fiscal balance sheet, it starves the real economy of capital and doesn't contribute to economic growth and the expansion of the formal economy that could potentially help meet those debt obligations in the future. I'm a Brit. we've just had a general election. The Labour Party, who won, spent the entire month of the election campaign banging on about economic growth to enable them to not raise taxes, to pay our bill, to invest more at home. So I'm kind of biased because it's been happening in my head, but I think it is true. But ultimately, creating a new institution with strong governance structures to crowd in private investment is a political decision. However, as I was saying earlier, there's a huge opportunity, because if we're looking in the geopolitical situation the world is in now, the US is looking to source critical minerals and closer to home and create supply chains. So there is a potential to use those new revenues to create integrated and value, not only just mining and exporting primary materials, but using a sovereign wealth fund or a strategic investment fund, not only to save some of that money potentially, but to generate whole new value-add industries around some of these critical minerals that will definitely have a market. They're going to be critical, as you know, for the energy transition. And if we have a commercial orientation and you're going to attract those private investors, you've got to align with their ESG commitments. So it's not a way that these companies, these private investors, are going to have, policies around protecting biodiversity and nature preservation and, social issues around working with indigenous communities. And I think that in this region, this is particularly important. And if you've got a state-owned investor that is going to prioritize those, that's super powerful, and you're going to make more sustainable, longer-term industries and clusters than you would otherwise do if you just had private investment. So I think that that's an important point. And as I said, while sovereign wealth funds aren't impact investors, thinking about the impact they have is really important. So, last slide before cocktail. Hooray! So, what are the keys to success? And I think we've covered these really importantly. So, competitive long-term returns. They don't have to be entirely private sector if you're going to do a strategic investment fund like we've been covering, but they do have to be competitive. You're providing non-concessional capital, which is where these kind of institutions can complement a BNDES or one of the other development banks in the region, IDB or CAF, to do this, right? You crowd in capital. Not by investing in projects that the private sector would do anyway, maybe like offshore wind. You're crowding in capital by taking minority stakes in kind of marginal businesses that have a good business case, but might need a little bit of help somewhere in the capital structure, whether that's in equity or mezzanine or something that's going to crowd in equity or senior secured debt. As I said, you can leveraging local knowledge and government ownership to create a differentiated, de-risked pipeline of deals, really important. You guys have got the local knowledge, you're the government, you can find those deals. And building partnerships with a range of partners in both public and private sector. Building that blended capital stack, understanding what everybody wants is important. But if you know what the mandate is, it's great. It's going to work. That's how you catalyze inward investment. So, impact. So, link it to the national development agenda. Make sure you retain expertise so that you can develop those new sectors. Give people jobs that really matter. As I was saying earlier, people need to have a sense of purpose, do interesting things. That's all part of the impact as well. And as I was saying about the African examples, building that financial knowledge and innovation is really important. And as we were saying earlier, make sure that your projects are going to be aligned with whatever impact framework you choose. It's usually the SDGs. And finally, governance and accountability. I'm going to go for implement the Santiago principles because that's what I always say and that's what my book is. But they are there for a reason, and they've been around for 15 years because they work. And, I think also being clear about what that is. So one thing that I've learned is that if you want partners, if you want to crowd in private capital, have a governance structure that everybody knows and is clear what it is from a legal perspective. You don't want your partners to not invest because they've got to spend a fortune on lawyers understanding what your funky new structure is that they've never seen before. Make it easy for people. Create it as something that they understand and that they can do business with. And finally, which I know is in Brazil's DNA because I've seen it, regular, transparent, and reporting to international best practices, IFRS, whatever your accounting standards are. But make sure that this is important because if you're not transparent, your citizens don't know what you're doing. And that's where the politics comes in. If you're very clear about what you're doing, how you're doing it, as one of my members once told me, the reason he comes from an African country, the reason his fund has worked is because they were so transparent as to be naked, and that built trust. It took time, but that's what built trust. So that is my final gambit, I think. So that is a really, really fast trip through that report. And as Paul says, it is available in Portuguese. Thanks to Paul, who had it translated for me. I hope that you can read this and take some of the lessons that we've done home. So thank you very much.